Okay, we are live. So go ahead. You've had some questions about melody and theme.
Right. I think it's really simple. Like, what's the difference between melody and theme? Are they different? Are they the same?
I think for a contest or purposes, or even inside the film world, we tend to use those terms interchangeably as synonyms. And I think that's fair for all practical purposes. I think if you had to make a distinction, I would say a theme is the overall thematic idea behind a symphony or a film score, and the melodies are the individual groupings of notes that represent that theme. So, for example, if thematically you decided for this war movie you're going to use warlike stuff, you're going to use a lot of percussion and drums, the thematic concept is all the music's going to be warlike and heavily percussive. That's the thematic concept. But then inside of that you might have the good guy melody and the bad guy melody, and they'll use those thematic elements, but those are the specific manifestations of the theme per character or per dramatic structure. But I think that's, this is probably a semantic discussion. For most of us, when we talk about theme and melody, I think we're using them interchangeably. And certainly if you ask composers, you look at liner notes for film soundtracks, they use the words theme, I think just because it sounds cooler than melody, but not because it's representative of some symphonic structure or other structurally precise terminology,
Yeah, I guess I'd agree with you. Maybe theme infers drama in some way, where melody might be a little bit more of a neutral word. And if we're going to pick at it, it would just be because we're nerdy composers in our little music world, and maybe the world at large doesn't decipher between the two.
Yeah, maybe. Of course, you could argue that too and go, who wants a melody that's not dramatic, right? That doesn't, because isn't ultimately all we do. In my master classes, I talk a lot about, instead of thinking about music as this mystical, alchemy, think of it as language, because it is a language. And you communicate using the same syntaxes, grammars, and vocabularies that are common to listeners and to other musicians in order to effectively connect with people, just the way we do in English. We use all the same words. And stylistically, we group them together in certain ways that depends on the circumstance. But ultimately, we're moving a dramatic, story forward. I think Ravel talked about development as being continuity of interest, and I think that's one of the best ways to put it. And that is the essence of drama. It moves you forward, So I think even if you have the humblest goals in mind for writing a melody, you still want it to be engaging and memorable and make a connection with people. We can talk some specifics about that too if you want, but what else?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we could talk about the mechanics of a melody, maybe what makes a melody really work.
Yeah. This is by the way, this is a huge, enormous topic. I've done hours and hours and hours and hours of master classes on these. But I think the first thing we have to decide is we have to agree on some terms. Well, like what's a good melody? What's a good theme? And I think if we can agree that a good melody and a good theme is one that makes that connection with your listeners, that becomes memorable and predictable enough that they can integrate it into themselves. We have to remember that 99% of the world isn't musicians. And when they can make a connection with music, it's a very, very powerful connection for them. It's often said, that good melodies are simple melodies. I think that's not enough. That's part of the equation. What's most important for an effective or melody or theme is that it has patterns that people can recognize, because that's how we make connections. We make they can be rhythmic patterns, they can be intervallic patterns, they can be harmonic patterns. There's lots of different ways to do it. But one of the things that we always do is we capitalize on patterns that people recognize. If you play a simple 1-4-5 progression, to Western ears, everybody in the West knows what chord is next. They know that's coming because that's a familiar pattern. We've heard it 100 billion times. And that's why these chord progressions are used so often over and over and again in pop music. It's because it immediately takes the every person and makes them feel smart. They know what's coming. They know as much about the music as the musician, and they're not even a musician. It's a very
familiar in their body.
Very much. And so when you're doing this, as predictable as it is, you're also making a confidence-building connection with your audience. And to capitalize on that, by as soon as they think they've got it all figured out, going that's like a magic trick to most people. Like, oh wow, I didn't hear that one coming. And for us, as simple as it is, that's the essence of how we structure the usage of patterns to make connections. It's going to be a constant flow of things that are familiar and then things that are new. I can give you. Oh, let's talk some more about it. Another way of doing it is capitalizing on. This is musical now. Is chord tones, because chord tones reveal the underlying chords beneath them. So on some very fundamental level, for most people, an effective melody is going to have both of those elements. It's going to have a pattern, some sort of pattern, and it's going to outline chords. And if those chords are familiar in their pattern, then you've got, like, for example, if I just played... That's going to get in your head if you play that about 10 times. It's going to drive people nuts. And part of the reason is because it's a 1-4-5 progression outlined. I'm just outlining the triads. And there's a rhythmic pattern. Dun, 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 dun. I just repeated it again. And if you start looking at melodies that are memorable, you will see this exact thing done over and over. If you look at the Raiders March, there's your C major chord. If you just play the melody, you can hear the chord. Most people are hearing this because to a Western ear, that's what it would be. And here's the seventh, a third rather, and seventh, which is, and then he does 1, 2, 3. So for us, knowing that the most powerful chord tones are the thirds and then the sevenths, right? Because if you have this, I don't know, is that happy or sad? That's happy, that's sad. The third determines the whole thing. So, but for him, in using that melody, as simple, as childlike as it is, it immediately has a sense of familiarity for it. Because it is familiar. It's 1-4-5, for God's sakes. And, without a chord underneath it, when you get to that second part, the average person thinks it's an F chord. But then here's where he gets to do the new thing. Oh, hey, that's cool. So, and again, you could do this with 100 billion melodies, and you will see that they capitalize on those two qualities. They tend to reveal something about their underlying chord structure, and they use patterns. And those can be patterns of any kind. Those could be intervallic patterns. For people, just do it twice, and that makes a connection with people. Forget the strength of this idea. That's really a separate idea. That's our burden. That's the contestant's burden, is to come up with a really great melody. But the fundamental building blocks for it will always be the same. If you just start playing, melodies and chords that don't build patterns, no matter what you come up with, people will never lock onto it because they can't figure out what the structure is. They can't predict anything about it. And it's very, very fatiguing for listeners. And, here I used a couple of really simple examples because Raiders is 1-4-5 and my example is 1-4-5. But that doesn't preclude us from using stuff that's even chromatic. Like, let me give you another example. And I'll just do it one-handed. You know what those chords are. I can give them to you. Is that what I did? Right? And just the fact that, and by the way, that also shows you that you have a development trick. You could play that melody on solo horn just by itself and start to, and then you have a place to build it when you bring in the bottom. But But so here we had chromatic motion, and yet, sort of a pseudo-Spanish thing, I guess, by the sound of it, and yet anybody can connect with that. So we shouldn't think that just because we're outlining chord tones that really, limits our chord potential, because it doesn't. And then you could go on from that, you can move on. And in all those cases, I'm just doing the same two things over again. I'm establishing a pattern, a rhythmic pattern, and I'm outlining chords. Honestly, if you stuck to those two things and burdened yourself with those limitations, you'd be well on your way. And limitations are good for creatives. Any kind of limitations, even if it's an artificial one that we impose on ourselves, because otherwise we just sit here nervous and feeling like failures because we have no ideas.
Putting yourself in a box.
Yeah, and so and this is what I'm doing here are sort of a traditional. These are sort of traditional lines, but I know when I started writing, actually separate melodic ideas were difficult for me. I thought in chords. Which of course contained melodies in the top notes of the chords, but some composers I found still think that way. It's very common, and that shouldn't stop you from developing a melody that way too. So, meaning a melody which is inextricably tied to the chords behind it. As an example, like you might do. Okay, just that for people, and if you just do it twice, so people know you meant it. That is a hook. That's a theme. That's a melody. It's a melodic, and it's doing exactly what we talked about. It's repeating, and it's in this case, it is defining its chords just because of the way I performed it and the way I thought of it. So I want composers to realize too that if that's the way that they think, which is actually kind of how I think, then don't fight that either. And again, once you've established that idea, we can continue to develop our idea by recruiting parts of the pattern. So maybe we just want to take we've sort of this waltzy kind of thing. What I did? You can still move this places. You can move it. You can still move it, and just be capitalizing on the rhythmic aspect of the pattern. But the more things that are familiar and pattern based, the more your everyday average listener is going to be able to connect with it and follow you as you develop and move away from your initial idea and increase the drama.
Making patterns and kind of trying to hook people in from as many different angles as you can.
I was trying to think of if I could do an example with maybe just even two chords, pretty much. Yes. You could just here's just one more example. So because I just don't want people to think, that it should be simple, even for us on some very fundamental level, because we tend to think that we have to make it sophisticated and we can't do things, that's always done. I have to break new ground and everything's got to be a new chord and a new progression. And I think that's actually a season that we go through as composers. I remember my season of that. And so I went through a season where everything I wrote was something nobody ever heard before and nobody could connect with it. Just because it was like, what are you doing? And it was all these super complex jazz chords. So simplify. And here, if I was going to do something using just two chords, something like that. It's just two chords, and you still have plenty of development room. You can just do this all day, same ideas. And I'm just spitballing here. This isn't a particularly fantastic idea, but the idea is that I'm really keeping it very, very simple, very, very simple. And I guarantee you that if any of one of us took even these half-assed ideas and used them as an anchor upon which to build developments and modulations, we will effectively create melodies and themes that connect with audiences. And then they'll catch themselves humming it and singing it, and then you've got them. Now it's become a part of the definition of who they are. It follows them around. They're carrying it around with them in life. And that is generally the thing that people like most about melodic and thematic music, is it's now theirs, and they can sing it in the shower, and they can pass it on to a friend, or in the car. It's transportable. That's a huge quality.
That's a good pivot point too, because the next phase of this fund is going to be taking themes that I'm hoping will be statements and devoid of much development, and developing it, orchestrating and arranging. And so I wonder if you would have any advice for someone embarking on that, listening to a bunch of different melodies, maybe first what to listen for, but then what are some techniques you could employ?
Well, of course, even just doing this, I did some development on my, just right here. One of the things that I recommend when looking at modulations and developments, you have to sort of know you have to look at your own material. If you've got a melody that goes, spending some time realizing, well, in its home world, that's a C major, but knowing that it has this other life, or being able to think about all the other contexts that it can exist in is just a useful thing as an arranger or as an orchestrator. This is really arranging we're talking about. To think about how you can repurpose those ideas. A simple major triad can be a C major triad can be that. It can also be this. It's the same major. So if your melody is, well, you're saying two very different things here, or those are very different ideas with the same melodic idea, but it's a development. So spending some time just with your own piece, and I'm assuming this is because most of us create melodies by accident. We just plunk around and we just try to find stuff and say, well, that sounds cool. So spending some time, that's a C, but it's also, that. Looking at, this doesn't require any particular theory knowledge either. This can be just some time experimenting and writing it down or recording it so you don't lose it. Is useful. Another thing is, that I recommend is if you're a piano player especially, don't ignore where you put your hands when you created the piece. One thing that I see people doing, which I think is a mistake, is they'll write a piece and it's they'll play whatever, and then they go to orchestrate it, and it's like this giant huge thing, and it's all blown out, and there's 12 horns on it, and my advice is that's not what you played, that's not what you heard. When we tend to try to realize what we hear in our head, we shouldn't ignore the default things that we do. If you find yourself playing a melody and you're going, if you find yourself doing that kind of thing, that doesn't necessarily translate into a direct arpeggio with the orchestra. What it tells you is that the device orchestrationally that you're looking for, the one in which it moves and flows, versus you're not going to just write this for block chords for the orchestra when you go to write that melody, because that's missing the flavor, that thing that you were intrinsically motivated to do when you were doing this. So a lot of times orchestration questions, when you get into orchestration or arranging, a lot of times people think about orchestration as something separate from the composition, and I think that's a mistake. I think about them as inextricably linked, and trust yourself. If you find yourself writing a melody and your melody is, if you're finding yourself play there, and you want to know where to orchestrate it, well, look immediately at what instruments are soft and delicate and comfortable in that exact range. Well, you got flutes up there. It's not going to be clarinets. Clarinets you have to put a lot of air in it to get it's not going to be sweet and delicate. So right now, that's probably flutes. It's not going to be trumpets up here, for God's sakes, unless it's a piccolo. It's not going to be, it's probably strings or flutes or both. It's told you right away a whole bunch about the orchestration just because of where you initially and instinctively started your process. So as you go through modulations, whether that's an orchestrational modulation or whatever, trust your inherent instincts as you conceive the ideas. Another piece of advice that I would give is when we write a piece, we tend to write the most complete version of it that there is. We tend to write the one that's got the most idea. But those also tend to be the ideas that are the most final. They tend to resolve the hardest, the most strongly, and thus don't really need any more development. Once you've gotten a good, strong 5/1 cadence, you kind of don't really need to go on. So one thing that I recommend is find the simplest version of your melody or your theme and don't give away the strongest version of it. Don't give it away in the beginning. Build to it. Make that your last statement of it. Frustrate the 5/1 until the last possible second. And I think this one is important too because we live in this epic epidemic where nothing's epic because everything's epic and it's just boring. It's just epic plus epic plus epic equals nothing. And the only way for a thing to be epic is if it has the contrast of when it wasn't epic, of when it was small and full of potential and all of this, and then it builds. You've got to have that contrast. So if you've given out the thing right from the beginning because because that's how you feel it, you also have nowhere to go. And when composers find themselves trying to it's got to be bigger. We'll bring in more drums and we'll bring in more choir. But that's vertical development, and it is not the most powerful way to develop drama. Horizontal development is the most powerful way to develop drama. So if that's meaning melodic, harmonic development versus just stacking instruments or sounds. A lot of times, when we don't have training in how to move chords and ideas along, then the substitution for that is vertical development. So you hear this all the time. So it's just the one idea, and it might just be nothing. It might just be, and then but that'll just keep going. And now there's that plus drums, and then it'll just that plus choir, and then it's just that plus on top of it. But it's not actually going anywhere musically. It's the same exact sentence over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, and it's banking on saying it differently, saying it the exact same thing, louder voice, quieter voice, more things to move the development, and that's effective. But nowhere near as effective and as horizontal development, which is what you'll see in any Williams or Horner or Silvestri or Goldsmith score, or any composer who's been symphonically trained. That's why you can have a 6-minute Jerry Goldsmith cue in a Star Trek movie when nobody's even talking. It's just his music, and the whole story's happening. And that's why you can watch a John Williams movie or listen to a score and hear the whole movie unfolding, and you know what act you're in and what moment you're in, because it's the horizontal development. Today's scores are not that. Today's scores are a collection of cues, all of which are perfectly cool and perfectly appropriate. They fit the scene perfectly, but they do not together weave a cohesive musical story that unfolds in act dramatic structure like the screenplay. That's the only difference. A lot of people think it's about themes versus not themes. The difference between scores today and scores 30 years ago is structure. Symphonic structure versus isolated island-like cue structure.
Speaking of that other level, something, for some reason, I had turned on Braveheart yesterday.
Okay.
Hadn't seen the movie in 10 years. And it's striking after not seeing the movie for so long, listening to a classic Horner score. Right. And just the style of the recording and the orchestra, and the way he weaves his ideas and presents them.
Right.
It's just so much different. 20 years ago.
Yeah, and again, I think there's sort of a baby in bathwater thing there, where, I mean, Hans Zimmer, told me once that he just thinks that modern films reject themes. I don't actually agree with him on that point, but I know what he means. Some of it is that even films, the way they're dramatically structured, they don't all follow the 3-act structure anymore. Some of them have 9 and 12-act structures. And it's usually because the writers can't figure out how to keep it interesting for an hour and a half. So it's got to be... The pattern now is, you'll see, instead of the movie moving through a 3-act dramatic structure, which we've had successfully since Aristotle, this is 2,000 years now, suddenly now we have to have 9 structures. So the team go and they get the thing, and then they get the sit back, and then they get to the thing, they find the thing, only it's not the thing, it turns out it's actually another guy, and now they're like a whole other movie's happening. And so by the end of the movie, all the goals have changed, and all the things have changed, and you're like, okay, all right, I guess now we have to find the city of Emerald, and then you get there, but it's not, it's a hologram, and you just got to keep changing. And so we've actually seen a breakdown in terms of long-form dramatic structure in the screenplays and so it follows to me that on some level the music would similarly not feel a burden to be one cohesive idea. In one of my classes on scoring, I actually did a thing. It was a contrast between when Zimmer and Newton Howard, I think, did the first Batman. And, and there was just whatever that was that's all it was. That was like the whole idea, right? Which was great. It's great. But what was fascinating about it, and I did it, it was between that and the Force theme from Star Wars. And we just watched the films, and we just looked at how the themes developed over the course of the films. And the Zimmer and James Newton Howard themes were presented exactly the same way, orchestrationally, tempo, everything, exactly the same way, the very first time that you heard them, and the very last scene in the movie. And they were always totally effective in the movie, but they literally did not develop in any way. So if they're tied to a character thematically, it's like saying the character never developed. Whereas when you hear the Force theme as it goes through Star Wars, it mirrors what's going on with Luke and what's going on with the drama. So in the beginning, when it's that, lone horn, he's looking out the sunset, and by the big Death Star battle at the end, it's this militant version of it with confidence and bravado, just like the character has and just like the drama has. And all throughout that film, it's been weaving its way into moments so that you become familiar with it, and you also become familiar with the way in which it's changing as the characters are changing. It makes the bonds and the connection between those elements infinitely more compelling for an audience, even though at the moment they all work. You kind of don't realize it until it's over, but that is a structural difference. That is a developmental structural difference, and that's what's different between today's scores and even 20, but certainly 30, 40 years ago. This is what I was saying about the baby in the bathwater. We didn't actually have to throw structure completely out the window just because people decided that woodwinds are fruity. Which is, it's like we don't want to hear woodwinds anymore. That's not a cool sound. And 4 horns, which were enough to get through The Empire Strikes Back, actually used 6. That's a little, but still, now we got to have 12, and it's all got to be bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. There was nothing actually requiring that. If you want to hear epic, listen to the opening of Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe. That's way more epic than anything that's coming out in a theater, and I don't care how many horns you have because of its structure. But even if we have decided we want to have more of these percussive elements, we want to have fewer woodwinds, we want to change the palette, we can still use whatever palette that we're using structurally to develop in that way that's been time tested for hundreds of years. We just didn't do that. We just threw the whole thing out. So, which ultimately leads to Hans's comment that that these films reject melody. Well, honestly, nobody's really trying. Nobody's really writing symphonically developed scores in a modern sound palette. So I think younger composers should know that that's an untapped market. They want to do that. They have to do an ass ton of study, because you can be a film composer today in a way that you wouldn't be qualified to get sandwiches for Jerry Goldsmith 50 years ago. That's a brutal reality, whether we want to face that or not. That's personal, but that's the truth. The amount of training and experience that Jerry and John and all these guys had. I mean, it's decades of study. It's decades of study, and you're studying the symphonic works, and usually in a master-apprentice relationship, which they don't really have access to. So if you decided that you wanted to recruit all the best parts of music from the golden era, let's call it, but you wanted it to sound and feel, cutting edge and wavefront and all that, you could do it. Any of us can do it. But not by buying more plugins and you got to go back. You want to learn to do that, you got to go back. You got to study symphonically and learn to develop your ideas. But that's a huge power. That's a force multiplier by orders of magnitude. I don't care what kind of music that you want to do. If you know how to develop it and control it and keep moving from consonants or from dissonance to consonants and keep that continuity of interest simply because of your training, I don't care what music you're doing, you're more effective that way. You're more effective that way. Otherwise, you are chasing tricks and plugins. So I think there's a whole other thing that hasn't been explored yet. Personally.
I think my opinion on that. I mean, I agree. And on top of that, there's a vulnerability about writing a melody that, for some reason, is blocking. That people aren't wanting to do it because it's vulnerable to make a really beautiful melody. I'm not really articulating.
I understand what you're saying, and I know I totally get it, and I think that people should take heart that people like John Williams are explicitly, candidly clear that writing melodies is the hardest part of it. If you're struggling with it and having self-doubt, well, first of all, that's just being a musician. But second of all, just know that so is John Williams, that none of those melodies that we've all come to know happened quickly or easily, that he struggled with them. And that's struggling with the highest level of skills you could possibly conceive in every other way, developmentally and chordally and even as a performer. So, yeah, that's natural. It should really suck. It should take a lot of time, and we should have a reasonable expectation that 90% of stuff we're going to do is complete dog crap. We should just have that, just get real with it, that you'll write 100 and one will be good. And that's fair. So write a lot and keep a sketchbook. And I never sit at the piano without recording it because you never know. Some days you just get lucky. We've all had those days where it's like, wow, everything's great today. And those other days it's just this wasteland. It's this barren desert of nothing. It happens. Less so as I've been at this 30 years. You develop tricks to get you through that. But it's not easy for anybody. So I think that you got to forgive yourself a little bit. But also don't back away from the challenge. And start small and start simple. That's what I'm saying. If you start with some of these basic guidelines and force yourself to write some melodies inside of those guidelines, that'll help. Don't worry about sophisticated. If you can't do it simple, how can you do it sophisticated? I think every composer with dreams of 90-minute film scores should be able to write a serviceable pop ballad right now. Because that's as easy as it gets. So let's start there. And that's how I train composers, and that's how ultimately I learned. It's like, well, let's connect in the simple way. Because if I can build your confidence as a listener and you're like, oh, I like this guy's music, okay? And then I'm like, well, now that I got your attention, let me give you this, because you wouldn't have heard this before, and this will tweak you out. But you're going to go with me because you trust me now. I'm going to give you one. We'll get back to the familiar stuff. Don't worry. And then you just take them along, and they're like, wow. And you can throw them a little more. And that's also, by the way, how we resolve that unreal conflict between commerce and art, of commercial versus artistic. It should be both. You should be furthering your art and furthering our discipline and making a connection with people. That's part of our job. It's this gift that we get to give people. Go give it. Don't be selfish with it. So you do both by writing music, which makes people trust you and come in and make a connection, and then with their rapt attention and confidence, show them the new thing that you're pushing, and they'll appreciate it because, because it's how you are when you've got somebody's back and you're with them and you're rolling with it. It's a suspension of disbelief. It's like, I know this guy knows what he's doing. I like his work. So I'm going to listen to what he has to say. This is out there, but I'm going to listen to it. And now you've actually had an opportunity to make their musical ear more sophisticated. And that's our artistic goal, to further the art. So I see the idea that there's a either or a binary conflict there as being a total misstep. Make it both. Balance is in the middle. That's that's a tangent, but anyway.
Great. How did the disc clavier come through? It's just MIDI and then you assign it to a virtual instrument?
No, it's there's a couple of microphones underneath it.
Oh, wow.
And the MIDI out is feeding this what is this thing? Virtual MIDI piano keyboard. And so, yeah, I'm just MIDI'd out from the Yamaha to that so that people can see what I'm playing. But yeah, there's a couple mics on it. It's just a good old-fashioned. I've done. Go ahead.
Oh, you first.
I was going to say, I've done classes from my studio, virtually, and when I'm showing virtual instrument stuff or stuff at the rig, that's got a place too. But I began composing at a piano. It's still the most organic way for me, and a piano and a notepad and a pencil are still my fastest, most effective. I'm faster that way, and that's a survival skill. I've got bills to pay and deadlines to meet. So we all have to find our workflow. But I have found that even though on the surface it seems like it's the slowest way, it's actually for me the fastest way. I actually, I don't like writing. I just don't like the feel of pen. So I really force myself to go with my first instincts and get it down and move on, which is important because if you're as critical of your work as I am of mine, I hate everything that I do. If I don't keep moving on, I'll shit can all of it. I'll say it's terrible. I have no talent, and that's what I'll do. So I have to get it down and move on just so that it exists. So that's how I do it. But yeah, whatever works,
Mike,
man.
I want to thank you so much for joining me in this,
sure.
this discussion. And
yeah. Well, good luck with the contest. I can tell you from my own experience, having had people submit work, that there's a lot of raw talent out there. There's a lot of people with a lot to say and great ideas, and I've enjoyed very much the privilege of trying to give them tools to help them realize what they have inside, and I hope you are as pleasantly surprised by your submissions as I've been over the years. I hear stuff that I'm just like, damn. Why didn't I think of that? And once I get this guy some tools on where to go with it, he's going to make a difference. That's a cool thing to know is out there. And, for all our technical issues, that's also the reason we can know about each other that way. So thanks for doing your contest and good luck with it. And, let me know if I can help in any other way.
Thanks, man.
Okay. Talk soon.
All right.
Good night.
Take it easy.